We all know that every Beatle had a different reaction to the breakup of the band. John Lennon was excited to jump into his political agenda with his wife Yoko and fully embrace the experimental side of his music. George Harrison was on cloud 9, ready to embark on his solo journey after being held back by the power duo of the Beatles, and Ringo was just being Ringo. But when it comes to Paul, things were a little different. The Beatles were basically his whole life, and now that was being taken away. So it's natural that immediately after John left the group, he found himself not knowing what to do. So if you had to take a guess, what kind of album you think would be born as a result of this dark and confusing time in his life?
I don't know. And then number 2.
I've been wanting to make a video on McCartney 1 for a while now, mainly because a month ago, or maybe a little more than that, I made a video ranking Paul McCartney's entire solo discography, and I put this album above Band on the Run, that wonderful 1973 masterpiece by Wings. An album which is not only Paul McCartney's most critically acclaimed album ever, but also his best-selling one, selling more than 8 million copies, making it more successful than All Things Must Pass by George Harrison. So obviously, a lot of you were quite angry. Actually, a vast majority of the comments is people saying that I made a mistake putting McCartney 1 above Band on the Run, and even though I stated clearly that that was only my own personal opinion, a lot of you were still pissed. So I thought, maybe people don't really understand how important this album was for Paul, how the homemade quality of this album is exactly what makes it so special, and the fact that I've heard this album more times than an album like Ram or an album like Band on the Run is not simply because I have an attachment to this album. There's warmth and comfort found in the sound, and I can only explain that to you by explaining you the context in which this album was created and how it inspired a vast majority of the music I enjoy from the 2000s and the 2010s.
Well, probably that first McCartney album when I was, when the Beatles had broken up and I was on my own for the first time. And I got the 4-track Studer in my living room. And just like this, kind of just started making up songs and stuff. And it was a very bare album, very, I like it actually, so I like it as an album.
Talking about this album can be a little difficult because there's not a lot of detail to the instrumentation or the vocals. Actually, the homemade sound of this album is one of its most prominent features. And the main reason why a lot of people consider this album to be the beginning of the lo-fi genre, which a lot of you probably know since it's very popular in the 2010s, only serving as an example of how influential this album is, even though people like Brian Wilson, for example, from the Beach Boys had already done something similar in the album Smiley Smile, offering a very homemade quality to the sound of the album. This album, in my opinion, solidified that idea because it's not only that McCartney recorded and produced the album by himself, it's also that every detail of the instrumentation is actually crafted by him. The guitar, the bass, the drumming, and the piano playing is all done by him too. And explaining to you how complicated this probably was all the way back in 1970 is a bit pointless. It would be insulting your intelligence because nowadays we have computers, we can just run back the tape, listen to any details that we might have missed, and actually nowadays with AI, we can just solve it without even recording the thing again. But back then you had to do that on a tape recorder, and if you wanted to modify any sound or if you wanted to clean something, you had to go back to the control room and fix it on the production stand. It was really complicated basically. So the fact that McCartney crafted every sound of this album by himself showcases his incredible foresight and creativity at the time of writing a lot of these songs. Because even if the instrumentation of this album isn't anything too special, often going for a 4-man squad, bass, drumming, guitar, and vocals, knowing if you got it right without listening to the rest of the band sounds like nightmare back in 1970. McCartney basically had to record one thing, then overdub the next, and so on and so forth until he got the finished song. And that sounds like a really complicated process if you don't have the proper technology for it. And most of this album wasn't even recorded in a studio, by the way. Most of the recordings took place at his home in St. John's Wood and then was mixed in professional London studios like EMI and Morgan. And that maybe explains why sometimes his vocals are way too echoey and the drumming, the percussion in this album is so dry. Which I think it's my biggest complaint with this album, the fact that the drumming is so crude and raw, a total contrast from that beautiful, round, soft drumming from Ringo Starr in albums like Let It Be and Abbey Road. Paul's vocals are a little bit all over the place in this album too. You go from his breathy vocals in Teddy Boy and The Lovely Linda to the chest voice in Man We Was Lonely and Every Night, but it's that nasal, tenorish vocals that he pulls in songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Junk and Ooh You that I think kind kind of break the album's continuity, you know, because it feels like it's a completely different person singing. He already did this in Let It Be when songs like Get Back and I've Got a Feeling. It's very impressive. It takes a lot of talent to sing like that. He clearly has a massive range, but just because you have the ability to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. And I think that this album is the perfect example of that, because once again, it breaks the album's continuity. It seems like you have a bunch of different moods scattered throughout the album. Sometimes it works. The White Album is a perfect example of packing a bunch of different styles into a single record and it working really well, but McCartney barely changes the instrumentation in any of these songs. So the fact that he tried to add a bunch of different performance styles over the same instrumental pattern is, you know, it breaks the album's continuity quite a bit. Then you have the fact that half of the songs in this album are only instrumentals, with some of them being less than 2 minutes long, which led a lot of people to believe back in 1970 that the album was rushed and barely finished, you know, and the fact that it was recorded in basically 2 months from December of 1969 to February of 1970 led even more people to believe that. Now, it's not necessarily weird for an artist to include instrumentals in their albums. For example, David Bowie, with the album Below, released in 1977, had an entire second half of only instrumentals. The difference is that those instrumentals were ambient pieces, some of the most groundbreaking at the time, incredibly interesting, a lot of care and thought put into them. Instead, the instrumentals featured on this album are basically rock pieces, you know, or art rock pieces that are not that interesting, and once again, some of them are barely even 2 minutes long. And the fact that some of the songs in here that actually feature any vocals were written while he was still with the Beatles in 1969 and 1968, like Junk, Teddy Boy, and Debatable, but Maybe I'm Amazed as well, led even more people to believe that he barely put any effort into this album, and it's really hard to blame him. Because, you know, considering the fact that he recorded, produced, and mastered this entire thing by himself, with the exception of a few contributions by Linda, he made this whole album in a relatively short amount of time. 2 months to craft an entire album, that's a lot. Well, I do believe that he didn't put that much effort into this album. I think this is basically an exploration of sounds by Paul, you know, someone that didn't really know what he wanted from music. So this album is basically just like a pilot of his solo discography, a pilot album. So technically we should hate this album, and considering the fact that I spent the last minute talking about all the things I don't like about the album, then why is it that I see this album as one of the greatest pieces of music, not only of Paul McCartney's discography, but of all time? What is it about the album that I think it's so special? Well, as I said in the beginning of the video, it's really hard to explain. I can barely put it into words. I think this is an album that you have to allow yourself to enjoy, not really focusing on the context or the amount of detail and care and effort Paul McCartney put into this album. You have to ignore the fact that this is the first release of one of the most creative and innovative songwriters of all time after he left the Beatles, the greatest band ever. You know, you have to ignore all of that and just think of this as an album. And if you're able to ignore the context and what came after this album, I think that's the moment that you're going to appreciate the album as much as I do. This album feels like revisiting an old friend, you know. Probably one of the most accurate descriptions of this album would be this clip by Paul and Linda McCartney performing Hey Diddle in their farm in Scotland. Paul McCartney's guitar playing, Linda's vocals, the kids laughing in the background, the nature, the dog, everything feels so right. It feels so peaceful, and that's exactly the feeling I get when I listen to this entire album. It's not about the quality of the music, it's about how intimate and private it sounds, as if this is a personal performance from Paul McCartney to you. Because of course there's a lot of beautiful songs in this album as well, like the tender vocals and simplicity of the song Junk, the power ballad Maybe I'm Amazed, considered by a lot of people to be Paul McCartney's best song. You have the beautiful lyrics of Every Night, the romanticism of the lovely Linda. You know, there's a lot of things to enjoy about this album, and even if you were only, you know, focusing on the quality of the songs that are fully finished in this record, this would still be a great album. But in my opinion, that's not how you get the most out of this album. If you truly want to enjoy it, if you want this album to embrace you, you have to see every sound as an exploration of Paul McCartney's melodic mind. When you're listening to this album, I want you to picture Paul McCartney in his living room, playing the guitar, playing the piano, playing the drums, recording the vocals. I want you to feel like you're there with him, and that's how you're really going to see what this album is all about. Maybe I'm taking this far too seriously, but that's what music is for me. You know, it's a transportation to another realm, to another space, and that's exactly what this album does, and that's the reason why I love it so much. There's a lot of things that happened during the release and recording of this album. Like Ringo started being kicked out of Paul's house when he went there to talk about rescheduling the release date of the album. Then you have the interview that was released with this album talking about how he wasn't working with the Beatles anymore, leading to this massive headline saying that Paul quit the Beatles. You have a lawsuit after that, and basically Paul was seen as the villain, the one who broke up the Beatles, a band that was basically a goldmine for music critics back then. So obviously not a single soul was going to give him a positive review. It doesn't really matter if he released Abbey Road 2.0. Even the idea of making this album was problematic because when John left the band in September of 1969, Paul was depressed. He was heartbroken, so he left to his farm in Scotland with his family, and for a good few weeks he barely even thought of music. He didn't even want to continue being a musician anymore. He didn't want to do it by himself. Every single piece of music he ever made was with the Beatles or with a quarryman or being being a part of a group, and now he was all alone, not knowing what to do. If it wasn't for this masterpiece of a woman, the beautiful Linda McCartney, we probably wouldn't even have McCartney 1 or any of Paul McCartney's solo albums, to be honest. So considering all the problems that he was going through at the time, being villainized by his fans, the critics, and most importantly, his bandmates, it's clear that this album wasn't going to be the most focused piece of music ever. And actually, I think part of that pain and confusion filters through the sounds of the album and makes it an even more relatable piece of music. Then, of course, you have the massive influence this album represented for the lo-fi genre, one of the most popular genres of the 2010s and the 2020s. Actually, a lot of people call this album the first lo-fi album ever made, which I kind of agree with. I do believe that people like Bob Dylan and Brian Wilson laid the foundations for lo-fi music. I do believe that this album was like the first solid example of a lo-fi album ever made, which is a big deal for me because as the genre evolved, it led to some of my favorite albums of all time, like The Glow Part 2, for example, by The Microphones. So yeah, I not only appreciate the album's sound, but also what it influenced. But yeah, even though I know that inside Paul McCartney's fandom, there's a lot of people who really do appreciate this album, actually a vast majority of fans love this album and see it for what it is, I think that people from the outside in fail to understand how amazing this album is. I think that they just see it as an unfinished piece of music, and because it's Paul McCartney, someone who went on to do albums like Band on the Run, Ram, Wings at the Speed of Sound, Venus and Mars, albums that are fully fledged, very well produced albums, don't really see this album as a finished product, as an actual piece of music relevant to Paul McCartney's discography, and I think that's a huge mistake. I understand that objectively this album pales in comparison to many of his other albums, but if you were to take the album a little less seriously, I think you'll be able to enjoy it a lot more than many of those other albums you're probably thinking about now. Because even if I'm willing to admit that Ram is the pinnacle of Paul McCartney's solo discography, and no album, including this one, tops that one, this is the album I've heard the most. Not only out of his solo discography, but even if you were to include some of the best Beatles albums in there, I've probably heard McCartney 1 many more times still. That's the level of enjoyability this album offers, and maybe after watching this video, you'll get a better picture of what McCartney wanted to do with this album, and so the next time you listen to it, you'll be able to enjoy it a lot more.
The cannabis seeds had been planted at his farm about 4 miles from here. It was said that those seeds had been sent to you. How did you come to grow them?
Yeah, well, we got a load of seeds, kind of in the post, and we didn't know what they were, we kind of planted them all, and 5 of them came up illegal.
But that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out an album, a song, or an artist, leave it down below as well. I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.